Hello, thank you for joining us today for All the Lonely People, Loneliness in Individuals, Organizations, and Society. My name is Lynn Vincent. I'm an assistant professor of management in the management department at the Martin J. Whitman School of Management at Syracuse University. I am joined here by Joel Carnevale and Charisse Lepre, who are two incredible researchers and colleagues, and I'm really looking forward to having a conversation on loneliness with them together. So I'm going to, before we really get into the topic of loneliness, I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves and say a little bit about themselves and their research in generally. Joel, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. Hi, everyone. My name's Joel Carnevale. I'm also an assistant professor here at Syracuse. And so my research really kind of at the intersection of leadership, workplace mistreatment, and employee work behavior. So more specifically, though, I focus on, and what I think is particularly relevant for our conversation today on loneliness, most of my research focuses on the influence of negative leader behaviors or leader personality traits such as leader narcissism and the effect that that has on employee well-being and work outcomes. So, for example, I've looked at things like the influence of narcissistic leaders on employee sense of belongingness at work and the detrimental effects that employees who don't feel that they're accepted or belong in their organization, the detrimental effects that those feelings can have on the way they behave and interact with their fellow colleagues, the way they interact with their leader. And also, if I failed to mention, so I graduated from Auburn University back in 2013. So I've been an assistant professor here for 3 years, going on my 4th now.
Thank you. Hi, Charisse. Can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Yes. There we go. Excellent. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Charisse Lepre. Technically Charisse Lepre Corsby Massey, but I go by Charisse Lepre. I am an associate professor over at the Newhouse School. My area of expertise is specifically media psychology. So I did my undergrad at MIT in neuroscience and media studies, and then my PhD is in social psych out of USC. In California, South Carolina. So yeah, my area of expertise really focuses on how we use media to think about ourselves and others, and also with respect to loneliness, 2 specific things. One, the way in which media can activate feelings of social exclusion through a lack of representation, or what media effects theorists call symbolic annihilation. So the absence of one's social group through the symbolic representation of culture, which is media, as well as the way media is used, so specifically media technology, digital technology, but also 20th century technology in resolving feelings of loneliness by activating a sense of belonging. So just to get ahead of myself, I will probably make the argument that loneliness as we construct it from a social perspective really takes hold through the mid-20th century. That's not to say that loneliness didn't exist before the 20th century, but from my perspective and my argumentation, I would say that we have become so used to not feeling lonely, especially through the widespread adoption of streaming media technologies like radio and television, and then especially in the case of cable television, where content was specifically targeted towards individuals and served as this virtual companion. That's the environment we come into in the 21st century, where we rely on internet technologies, as we are right now, to activate feelings of belongingness and resolve feelings of loneliness. And I'm looking forward to applying our discussions of interpersonal technology, which is how I generally look at it, to practices of business and industry.
One of the things I appreciate about your approach to loneliness is the view of technology, because some people are arguing that technology is separating us in a way. It's putting us in silos in society. It's keeping us from making meaningful connections. We're all bowling alone now, right?
Alone together.
Yes, yeah. So I really appreciate your approach to it, and I think we're going to talk more about that. Yeah, so I joined Syracuse University in 2015. I did my PhD at Cornell University in the Industrial Labor Relations School. My work primarily focuses on the social and moral implications of creativity. So when you ask someone to be creative, you might get a creative idea or a solution or a product, but what else are you going to get? And my research really dives into that what else. And that's the path that brought me to loneliness and loneliness adjacent topics. So I usually approach it from a identity lens, where I look at creativity as an identity. So not just that you engage in creative behaviors, but you see yourself as a creative person, that's part of your identity. It's important to you. It's part of your social construction of yourself. And that's what brought me to, into loneliness. So how we're going to take it from here is I'm going to define loneliness and explain why we're here. Why do we care about this? And then we're going to open it up for a discussion. And this discussion will work really well if you are part of it. So if you have any questions, there's a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, or it might be on the side depending on how you have it formatted. Please type in your question. We would love to hear from you so we can all talk about loneliness together. So, all right. When we talk about loneliness, what is it? So loneliness is usually described as this painful, negative, aversive feeling that is subjectively evaluated or situationally induced. And it signals this deficit of desired social relationships. Okay, so let's break that down. What does that actually mean? So it's something negative. It's painful. We actually can feel loneliness in our brain in the same way that we register pain, like physical pain. So it's negative. We don't want to feel this. And that's important because you can be alone and not feel lonely because you're content with it. You're fine. It is subjective. So it is your interpretation of your social connections. So if you have two people that each have 10 connections, 10 friends, one person might feel lonely if they don't feel satisfied with those connections, while the other person doesn't. So there's not a magical number. There's not one way to look at someone and say, oh, that person's going to be lonely when that person is not. It is very subjective. And it's important because you might have someone who you see as a social butterfly who actually feels very lonely. It's situational. So you might feel lonely in one context, like you might feel lonely at work. You might feel romantically lonely. You might feel lonely in your friend domain or your family domain, or it might be pervasive. You might feel lonely all the time, but it could be just situationally induced as well. So that's the definition of loneliness. So it's negative, it can be situationally induced, and it signals this lack of social connections that you want. So why do we, yes, Sharice.
I just wanted to know whether it was appropriate for me to type stuff in the chat window, because I typed and then I didn't hit send. As Kelly Clarkson said, it doesn't mean I'm lonely when I'm alone.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's actually one of my notes down here is being alone does not mean that you're lonely. So loneliness is that evaluation that you're missing the connections, the relationships that you want. So you can be at home watching movies and be happy, and be alone, be happy with that. It's just this evaluation that in a certain domain, you don't have the connections, you don't have the friends that you want. Why do we care about this? Well, it looks like loneliness is not a new experience, but it does seem to be a increasing experience, where there was a 2018 survey and 54% of 20,000 Americans surveyed indicated that they feel like no one knows them well. So 54% of people said they don't have a close connection in general. Why do we care about this in a management setting, in a workplace setting? Well, another recent survey found that 42% of people surveyed said they do not have a close friend at work. So why do we care about that? Well, the effects of loneliness can be overwhelmingly negative. We have fatigue, depression, morbidity, mortality. We have decreased organizational commitment. We have decreased job satisfaction, lower job engagement, which then affects others. You have a decreased job performance. I mentioned earlier that people feel loneliness as physical pain. It registers in the brain in the same area. So essentially, people who are lonely are sadder, sicker, and worse at their jobs. And it's hard to get out of that loneliness spiral. So that's my intro to loneliness. Joel, Sharice, did I miss something?
I don't think you missed something. A couple questions I would ask just to situate the scope of this conversation. And then of course I have another question, but just a question I would ask is, so if loneliness is situational, does that make it inherently temporary? And at what point does loneliness advance to a depressive state? And is this conversation, as we're talking about loneliness, again, as a psychologist, right? As we're talking about loneliness, are we literally talking about a state that we assume to be temporary and letting a clinical state of loneliness, like separating that out for the time being? Or are we acknowledging how that temporary state can evolve into a chronic state?
I think we acknowledge that it can be a chronic state. I think it is important to say that the researchers do approach this as an evaluation or a state, as you indicated. It's not a trait, it's not a personality trait. Like you can say, I'm open to experiences or I'm an agreeable person, but as part of your personality, you can't say, I'm a lonely person as your personality. But you can say that you are chronically lonely, that it is this pernicious, pervasive feeling that can define your approach to your life and to other people.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the insidious things about loneliness is it can be quite self-reinforcing, because lonely people tend to also have lower self-esteem, they experience more negative emotions, and that in turn can cause them to socially withdraw, doing the very opposite thing needed to do to reach out to those kind of build those social bonds.
That's one of the things that always irks me. And okay, I feel like I'm about to back myself into a corner, but I'll get it out. One of the things that always irks me when we have conversations about depression or suicide, especially in media, like when we hear news stories or stuff, they always end the story with, if you or anybody you know needs help, call this number. And I'm like, the whole thing about this is that I'm having difficulty asking for help. But the idea that's just like, oh, just call this number, it is counter to the state and the experience of being depressed or chronically lonely, just to get at some of the points that Joel just raised.
Yeah, because there's these other things that are happening in conjunction that are maladaptive to coming out of that state,
Right.
which is difficult for the person to, just do it themselves. Absolutely.
I might also inquire, because I'm always thinking about the intersectionality of all of these things, the statistics that you provided, whether or not those are salary earners or wage earners, as we think about how loneliness operates, especially within the workplace, right? Because we've seen, I would argue that over, bringing in the conversation about television and media content, we've seen the work family emerge over the past 50 years, right? Mary Tyler Moore. We've seen the work family emerge, and we're seeing it modeled as something that should be satisfying, right? You should get this and you should feel satisfied and have your work family. However, much of what I think we see is usually around professional workers, right? So my question might be, what do these statistics look like for wage earners or people who work in, and I'm certain this is a terrible term, but lower skilled labor, food service workers? Is there more loneliness in that space or less loneliness, and why?
That's a fantastic question. And one of my related question is the gig economy. Is where, for instance, you might have an Uber or a Lyft driver that is operating as an independent contractor, so they don't really have necessarily a strong connection to their organization, but they don't have steady coworkers that they see on a stable basis, but they do have lots and lots of incidental interactions that the research shows those acquaintances, those one-off encounters can be emotionally fulfilling and satisfying. But despite
what Tyler Durden would say, right, from Fight Club, where he says single serve friends.
Yeah, it turns out there's single serve friends, or there's acquaintances, those talking to the person who hands you coffee in the morning at the coffee shop. It can be really helpful and make you feel less lonely.
On a quick side note, I don't Uber very frequently, but is it possible for you to request the same driver? Every time I go into Uber, I get randomly assigned to any driver. And I always wondered, is it possible for me to say I'd like this person to be my regular driver?
I'm also not a frequent Uber, but I have heard of people doing that like on the side.
So yeah, making a personal connection.
Yeah, when they say like, here's my card, or here's my number if you need to, call me. So we had a question coming in from Kelly Lux that said, is there any research on how this affects remote workers, especially those who were traditionally in the office, thinking of all those who continue to work from home through the pandemic and beyond? First of all, Kelly, thank you for answering this question. This is we appreciate your engagement, and there's emerging research on this. The COVID-19 pandemic has definitely put a different flavor on the research on loneliness as we shift into more work from home situations, more digital interactions. This was emerging anyway, as the world does become more digital, more diverse, more globally dispersed. But Joel, I think you know more about this.
Yeah, so, like as you mentioned, Lynn, there is emerging research in terms of kind of I guess now continuing through COVID. But that's in terms of just because so many organizations have now had to abruptly move to distributed or remote type of work environments. But even before COVID, there has been over the past few years emerging research looking at loneliness in virtual types of environments where most of what the work that employees are doing are conducted virtually. So once again, distributed, so they're disconnected from one another, but connected through some sort of virtual platform. So, some of the research shows, as Lynn was saying, loneliness does affect work performance. There are things in the virtual environment. In fact, some of the things I was going to discuss shortly that can be done to mitigate that in terms of what can leaders do. Interestingly enough, at least some of the preliminary research suggests that leaders, I don't want to say matter like less, but in a way they do. Leadership style, leader behaviors, they don't quite matter as much in virtual context. Not as much as you might think, where we typically think, or leaders often think, oh, now's the time I need to appear even more energetic. I need to appear even more emotionally supportive, make myself available constantly, have multiple meetings throughout the day, have virtual lunches, have Zoom happy hours. It's not necessarily the case. And it doesn't mean that they don't matter, they just matter somewhat less in terms of those particular interpersonal type of behaviors. What actually matters more in virtual contexts is increasing engagement among employees themselves. So increasing communication, and not just any type of communication, the right type of communication, more informal type of communication. And so there are ways, what research suggests that can be done, whether you're talking about moving more from a traditional hierarchical type of leadership to a more shared type of leadership where individuals, members of a group or work team, they share leadership authority and responsibility. This actually increases communication among them, but it also increases the right type, once again, more informal, because typically in traditional hierarchical types of leadership, communication tends to be unidirectional and also fairly formal, which isn't necessarily conducive for trying to get people together and build those social bonds in a work group. That just kind of touches on a few things, but we could talk more about those. I think another interesting idea is, or thing that we're seeing is, once again, going back to those leaders and managers are starting to try to structure the virtual environment itself to try to create more community. But I have some reservations about that as well, but we could talk about all these things. Lynn, I don't know if you wanted to, or Charisse, jump in with any thoughts as well.
So someone who also studies loneliness, Hakan Salek, described what's going on right now related to traditionally in the office suddenly having to work at home as experiencing societal sudden organizational isolation. That's an academic naming something right there. One of the concerns that we can have with suddenly working from home more often is our interactions, our communications are occurring digitally. And that's a less rich communication style. We get a lot of information through nonverbal cues, verbal tones, body positions when we talk to someone face to face. And that doesn't happen over email, which is a very sparse type of communication style. Even video conferencing, it's not the same as talking to someone face to face. One of the concerns about that is if you are feeling disconnected, if you are feeling lonely, you are more likely to read those emails negatively, where you start to doubt those social connections. We tend to read emails negatively anyway. We tend to associate it with a more negative tone. So one of my concerns is, are we going to be seeing more conflict or even increased disconnection due to this? Yeah, Joel.
I actually want to jump in. I think there is that's absolutely, I think you hit the nail on the head where, these behavioral cues aren't easily transmitted, interpreted, or detected in, even in this kind of virtual environment, which makes it difficult for those, leader behaviors that are focusing on emotional support to, kind of get through a transmit as well. But at the other end, that also means that negative leader behaviors, so like leaders who are interpersonally insensitive, demeaning, like narcissistic leaders, that also isn't really transmitting quite as much either. So there's somewhat of a bright side where if you have a jerk boss, you may be less likely to be negatively affected in a virtual environment. That effect you're going to receive from them might be somewhat less than in a face-to-face type of environment.
On that note, I had a point I wanted to raise a while back about gig economy and organization, and I'll just put this out there, the way in which it also inhibits unionizing, right? Because so much of feeling like you have a community at work, and which then extends into demanding better treatment at work, comes from casual interactions. So I don't know if we have a poll function on this conversation, but I would love to take a quick poll or find out somehow, I don't know, I'm not a good Zoomer, how many people in our 50 some odd participants have engaged in an online happy hours or other efforts by your employer to engage casually outside of work. I find those, no, we can't do a poll. Okay, is there a chat option? I don't know. Anyway, I just think I see those all the time and they make me uncomfortable because I don't, it's just not satisfying, as we've already discussed. And I feel like suddenly I have to do more work. Like I have to be at work, but pretend that I'm not at work when I could just be off my computer doing something else. So that's just something to think about. Like, as Joel was saying, the skeletal psychological social interactions that we're experiencing in these distanced spaces can amplify or mitigate problematic leader behavior. But at the same time, when leaders are like, we're going to have a happy hour and everyone should bring a drink and we're going to do this and it's going to be fun, it never feels very fun. Maybe I'm just a lonely person. I don't know. And I'd rather be alone.
Well, you know the joke in academia that we study the things that bother us ourselves. Research is me search. We're just lonely people here.
And I think with those, you go ahead, Therese.
Oh, nothing. I think I was going to make a joke and then it already lost me. Keep going.
No, I think with those virtual environments, I think they have a lot of, those virtual type of like happy hours and meetings and virtual lunches definitely have their place. I guess I'm worried that I think that organizations that are using them can kind of take take the lesson from the open office space movement. And so it sounds quite different, but I think there are some similarities across them. So the open office space movement, this was of course pre-COVID, but it emerged, I don't know, 10 or so years ago, we're in full form. A lot of organizations said, hey, we could actually just tear down walls and have people in these open spaces, and they're going to, intuitively it made sense that, they should communicate more, they're going to collaborate more with one another. They're going to build greater social connections, even across departments where maybe they, wouldn't necessarily be interacting. And it's going to lead to greater creativity, greater performance. We're going to have, more social connection. And ironically, it did the exact opposite thing. We know now from multiple studies that open office spaces actually they're horrible. They still have their place in having an open space to congregate, but while also having private offices. The problem with the open office space movement is, people actually disengage, withdraw. They are less creative. They communicate less. And one of the problems was there was this underlying assumption in the open office space movement that privacy was somehow at odds with social connection. As Lynn knows from me knocking on her door pre-COVID, basically every day to talk, that's not necessarily the case. People like privacy, but they also, wanting privacy and wanting social connection are not necessarily at odds. And what sorry, go ahead, Therese.
Oh, I would also just say that the private space, just very briefly, and then please don't lose your thought, but the private space also allows for deeper connections, right? So if you are having a one-on-one conversation in an open space versus a one-on-one conversation in a closed space, you can develop a closer relationship with said individual without being self-conscious about eavesdropping. So, you know, there's the personal space, but the private space can also be an important way to resolve loneliness. Please
And
continue.
that's exactly where I think the virtual, some of what organizations have done since, especially since COVID, in terms of, you know, I consider it very much like they were structuring the physical environment in terms of open office spaces. They're focusing predominantly on the virtual environment. And it's done in some respects just that, where, you know, they'll have these, you know, we're going to have 30 people, you know, across multiple departments in a Zoom happy hour. And that is somehow going to get people, you know, that's going to satisfy the need for social connection. But the problem is, I mean, as anyone who's been to you know, like a cocktail party, no, you don't have one speaker talking to a group of individuals like what we're doing right now. You have private, you know, multiple, you know, micro groups that form where they have intimate personal conversations. And so a much better strategy would be, I think at least, would be to you know, structure the social environment in a way where people naturally go and maybe do those, you know, type of virtual events themselves. Doesn't mean you just don't necessarily, you know, don't have a virtual event or virtual lunches. But I think something very simple that could be done is leaders excuse themselves from some of these events, because it brings a level of formality that just isn't going to get people communicating with one another. Especially if you're new to the organization, you're going to probably sit there and do the exact same thing that you would do in open office spaces. You know, you're going to withdraw. You're not going to say anything in a virtual environment, especially if your boss is there, your boss's boss. You might be afraid of saying something stupid, and so you end up withdrawing anyway.
And I think that connects well to, there's two questions that I don't want to lose because one was from about 10 minutes ago, but I think that connects well with Derek Espadas. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly. Asking about, as an introvert, feeling, being around coworkers, especially since we're a super team attitude, exhausting, working remotely, get to interact in my own terms and in doses. And yeah, I avoid the happy hours. I just wanted to talk back to Derek's question very briefly, but then again, name, I'm doing my best, Jibin Ju also asks about the impact on children. But with respect to Derek and the comment that Joel is currently making, I also find the virtual space much less psychologically and emotionally taxing. We've moved all of our faculty meetings online, and it's great. First of all, because we actually make it through the faculty meeting agenda on time. Like, what's up with that? But then at the same time, and I don't know what you guys do at Whitman, but we always have like goodies. So there's always like this line, and there's always the small talk in the line, which, you know, I identify as an introverted extrovert. Like, I'm happy to put on my face. I do very well in groups, but I also find it very emotionally taxing and exhausting. So it's been nice to like show up, do the meeting, do something else, you know, and not have to go through all the small talk, which arguably I think people think resolves loneliness. But in reality, I personally feel, so again, yeah, research is research. I personally find it to be less satisfying because I'm taking time away from meaningful interactions that I could be having to engage in this small talk just so I can get a piece of carrot cake, because I love carrot cake.
Carrot cake is solid. So,
and yeah, I've got my opinions on SU catering, but their carrot cake is very good.
So what I'm hearing from across these different threads is connection is important, but we're looking for like authentic, organic type of connections that make sense. Like people who have some similarities or can be developmentally helpful for each other. So maybe these online happy hours are useful to a degree, but maybe there are other things we can do I think one of the things that's important in a more remote environment is acknowledging collective success, because it can create this sense of belongingness, this owned collective, triumph, that there is something that connects us. We've all done this amazing thing together, which can combat loneliness by creating this sense of connection. We have some really good questions coming in.
I'll
Yeah.
go. I'll just say I'm happy to very briefly, even if it's possible, to answer Christine Fu's question on social media and loneliness, because I think that there's some really interesting developmental ones here. So about children, about growing up with siblings versus an only child, about roommate partners, etc. So again, the sort of developmental piece. But my quick answer every time with loneliness and social media is it always depends on how you use it. And this is a big piece of the conversation that we often neglect. You'll hear people say, oh, social media is making us depressed, right? Well, if you're a very passive user, and I don't mean that in any judgmental sense, right? But if you're scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, which is how they want you to use it, they don't want you to leave. They want you to just keep scrolling in this sort of infinite, simple psychological satisfaction, right? Every new image triggers a sense of reward. So as you're scrolling, you get like these little doses of reward with something that comes up. And that can be, I would argue, very loneliness inducing, because at no point are you really getting anything meaningful. You're getting just this kind of onslaught of bits of content. Some are happy, some are sad. It's just, it's passive. Alternatively, if you actively use social media to resolve your loneliness, that is to say, I'm going to go and find a group that I connect with. I'm going to go find someone who's really into the things that I'm into and engage. I post, I like, I share, I have meaningful interactions with people online, then that would not necessarily resolve loneliness, but it won't be as loneliness inducing as the traditional sort of passive interaction. And I make this point explicitly because I had this in my notes to talk about today too. As someone who's done a lot of work on gay men of color, specifically in the early 2000s, just interviewing them and listening to them because we can talk about the intersectionality, the intersectional discrimination among queer communities, among communities of color with respect to queerness, large umbrella. And so listening to these Black and Latino gay men in like 2005 talk about how they couldn't come out to their families, they couldn't come out to church, but they could get online and they could find other people that they could talk to and connect with, really resolve that loneliness. So again, I can't convey this enough. Social media is a tool, and we should only use it in ways that make us feel better. But it's so overwhelming and offers so much stuff that figuring out how to use it is just yet another to-do item in a perpetually cluttered world. But that's my very long answer to what I promised would be a short answer. But that's just one of the things that really, it's just like a real key point. On a personal note, my book comes out next week. And I talk about all of these things in there about the way we talk about media and media technology, and differentiate that from how we could be using media. So I would argue if your social media is making you feel lonely, just put it on pause. And I'll say, as a functionally new mom, my child is 2 years old, I still have my own Instagram, but I started a completely new Instagram for him. And so he only follows family. And so now I don't even use my own Instagram anymore. I just use his because he has like 50 friends and that's it. And it's all of our family and very close friends. And it's very satisfying because I almost always run out of posts. Did you know that? Instagram will tell you, you've seen all the posts. And I'm like, sweet, I guess I'm done with the internet now. And it's just, yeah, play with social media. Try something different. Don't let Facebook tell you how you should use Facebook.
Charisse,
I'm done.
in line with what you were saying, I think I read where being authentic on social media is actually a really important way to mitigate some of the negative emotions and the negative effect that the use of social media has on one's well-being. And I'd imagine it would have to do something with the social comparisons that tend to occur using social media. And if you're just putting up a kind of an image of yourself that you think others might want to see. Is that correct? Are you familiar with that research?
I haven't read it. I've seen some discussion about it. I think a big piece of that is if we were all authentic, we would all be better off. But in the end, there's something very satisfying about being inauthentic, right? That's why you have hashtag no filter. But at the same time, it's emotionally taxing to present a consistently inauthentic self. So I could see how that would also just have a very direct individual influence, independent of the nature of social media. But we can move on. I'm totally going to Google this because I want to read it now. I missed that one.
So my work connects to this through the ability of creativity to deal with rejection and deal with cognitive burdens like having a secret. It's something that makes you feel isolated from other people or disconnected. And what my research indicates is that being creative can feel liberating. There's connected research that shows that being creative can feel like a personal disclosure, so that you are sharing part of yourself with other people. So whether it's through social media or through it's, pursuing a hobby in your personal life or pursuing an idea at work or starting an entrepreneurial venture where, something that's important to you that's, reflects who you are, it's a way to make connections with other people and reduce that loneliness. Greg Nickett asked a question in a statement that said, it seems like employees who live alone or those who are in an unhealthy relationship are more likely to feel lonely than those who have a roommate, partner, family, etc., especially in a COVID world. And it's true. We have seen members of what the research calls vulnerable communities did have increases in feelings of loneliness. So people who do live alone, single parents, people who have different abilities, minorities. We have, there's another group in there, elderly. They did have spikes in their senses of loneliness. I guess the one silver lining is that spike didn't continue. It did eventually, like after a couple months, kind of plateau. So they did see an increased sense of loneliness, but at least it didn't keep increasing. So that's.
And I'd like to.
I was just
going to say, I wanted to just add in there that it goes back to your point earlier, Lynn, where you said being alone, though, doesn't necessarily mean that you are lonely. And I know that there's work on, because one segment of the population that kind of picked up in the news since COVID were single and childless individuals, right? And but the research on single and childless individuals actually shows that they actually don't feel any more lonely. Now, I can't talk about the COVID environment might have somewhat changed that, but they don't necessarily feel any lonelier than those who are married with children, and mainly because they have, as long as they have those social connections that they can still draw on, even though they might not necessarily be living with them, as long as they still have those, social connections that support. And so, although I don't know how COVID affected it, but I would assume that would probably still hold to some degree, that the social support really is what's important, not necessarily whether you're by yourself.
I think the other thing I wanted to mention was also thinking about different types of workers. I feel like we keep getting pulled back into work at home workers, but the nature of essential workers. And I know Lynn is also an American Ninja Warrior fan. And so I just started this season. And so last night they had this whole segment on Pauline Avila, Jody Avila's wife, who's a doctor. And she was like deeply lonely, even though she has this satisfying home life, she couldn't play with her children because she was an essential worker and putting herself at risk constantly. So again, I think there's all of these nuances between, you know, having a home life, but if you're an essential worker, you can't come home and bring that risk to your family. And so you've got a effectively contact-free relationship at home, right? Contact-free delivery, contact-free relationship at home, which is also deeply, deeply unsatisfying and triggers feelings of loneliness, even when you are seeing them live and talking to them in real time. You can still feel incredibly lonely because those pieces are missing.
Therese, when you brought up that point earlier, it was something I hadn't been interested in recently with COVID. Just because I know within our own field, within our own field, most of the research is actually conducted in, focuses on knowledge workers, and which, you know, those are going to be the ones who are in distributed or remote work environments for the most part. And now there is research that, you know, focuses on frontline workers, but definitely not to the same degree. And it's something I've thought about, especially since COVID has exacerbated inequalities between, you know, blue collar workers and more knowledge workers. And yeah, so I personally think there needs to be a shift in terms of research focusing on more of the former, or at least some level of balance there.
And before we run out of time, I do want to get to Valerie and Jeepin's question, because Valerie asked this question about being an only child. I was totally raised an only child. I spent a lot of time alone, and you know, I feel like I feel functionally fine. I mean, admittedly, I have my family, but at the same time, I feel like being an only child and spending a lot of time alone generally has built up a lot of coping skills for us. Like suddenly I'm like, oh, I'm a totally well-versed for this pandemic thing. And even as a child, I would go to Guyana every summer. So I would be not just isolated at home, but then isolated nationally, right? Because I didn't have my friends. I was just living for 3 months on a farm with my grandfather. And so, you know, I think there's definitely, I don't want to say that only children have better coping strategies, but I do think that there is different coping mechanisms that emerged as children. And I think this was also particularly evident when we had like the Spectrum outage. Was that like a year ago? And there was no internet for like a day and people lost their minds. And you're like, yo, pick up a book. There's a book, I promise. You know, I feel like we're kind of getting out of the habit, coming back to my point that I made in my introduction. We've gotten out of, we're no longer well-versed, or we're no longer developing solo satisfaction, especially, as I said, on the other side of 20th century media. We expect the radio to constantly give us companionship, the television to give us companionship, cable television to be very specific. You know, as a young person, I want to hang around young people all the time, so I'm going to run MTV 24 hours a day, or whatever the case may be. I feel like we've really, in our hyper-connected world, miss out on developing these strategies, regardless of whether you're an only child or not. And then Jeevan talks about schools being mostly virtual, impacting a younger generation of students who lack the physical social interaction they usually get at school. And Lynn, you gonna feel that one?
Oh, you mean because I have a kindergartner who is doing virtual kindergarten, and it's really hard. I don't know how, Alex, I don't know how young of a generation you want to focus on, but my 5-year-old is feeling it. She's feeling disconnected, and it's really frustrating for her. So what are the long-term effects? I don't know. Maybe when she's 25 and can't make a friend, I can tell you. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think we can give her these coping mechanisms. We can create a sense of belonging that can take the place of that in-school physical environment. There are other coping mechanisms that we can do, and this relates to Valerie's comment. I did some research on social rejection and who are the people that can take social rejection and turn it into something positive, which in my case, my study was creativity. And I found after people have been socially rejected, the people that can transform it into a positive thing, like, oh, yeah, people didn't like me, but that's okay, were the people that had an independent mindset, the people who identify themselves as individuals rather than as part of a collective, or define themselves as socially, like, I'm a part of this group. They're like, no, I'm an individual, and it's okay that I was rejected because they don't get me, and that's okay because I'm unique, I'm interesting. So
I'll also just say very briefly regarding the situation of kids. We are not even one full semester into this virtual learning space, and a lot of the research demonstrates the resilience of children, especially the developmental psych research. So it might be really hard to watch right now, and we're also really bad at emotional forecasting. We can't even conceive of how fine our child will be literally 6 months from now. So, admittedly, we don't know what's coming, but if this is a 6-month phenomenon, and then we have a vaccine and we go back to school and things settle back into something where there is a connection, I have a lot of faith that this generation is not necessarily going to, statistically speaking, because I don't want to say that some kids are not going to suffer in the long term, but statistically speaking, this generation of kids might be okay if, we figure this thing out sooner rather than later. One of my buddies wrote on Twitter when school started and everybody was freaking out. He said, if we had said in March that we needed to figure out what to do so that football could start in the fall, we all would have tried harder. But in the end, we didn't even start talking about school till freaking June or July. And then here we are. So that was a completely unnecessary tangent. But I just want to make the point that kids are resilient. I have faith. And, this is still, in theory, a temporary phenomenon.
And Charisse, I think also to your point before about using social media as a tool is probably more important now than ever. I didn't coin this term, but there's a cell phone as a digital pacifier, basically, where if we rely on that, rather than building, especially for younger people, rather than building that necessary resilience and ability to cope in a more alone type of environment, it's probably going to be increasingly necessary.
Yeah.
Olivia asked a question about the connections of dreams and loneliness, that she and some of her friends are experiencing very vivid and realistic dreams during quarantine that include people that they haven't seen in years. And some studies that she's read suggest it's a result of a lack of personal connection in their lives. And do we have any insights?
I did see some of the conversation around this trend of lucid dreaming. So towards the beginning of the pandemic, there was this massive, people were having these ridiculous lucid over the top dreams, part of which was attributed to the lack of social connection, but also the hyper reliance on media content. Right, that suddenly we were clinging to the television, much like post 9/11, for those of you who remember post 9/11 media. We were just clinging to the television, like, what's going to happen? Are things going to change? Did anybody figure out anything? And nothing happens, right? But we just keep watching and hoping and begging. And I feel like we've gotten a little bit past that now. But, we are, as a society, increasing our ruminating, which will inevitably affect our non-conscious time.
Yeah,
that's it. That's all I got.
I think I don't know. I'm somewhat hesitant to. I tend to be hesitant to draw any kind of conclusions from dreams. I don't know the research on it very well. My understanding is that there's not much to draw from them. That they're just more about electrical pulses that occur while you sleep, and thoughts are kind of just appear, kind of as they appear when we're awake. So I don't know. I'm not. I would be, I guess, hesitant to say any which way or the other.
I'm not a dream expert, but I would argue that it's probably indicative of the things that you're thinking about and your brain. We are very good at protecting ourselves cognitively, not very good, but we have defense mechanisms, and it wouldn't shock me that people can use dreams to make these connections, or at least remind themselves of connections they have. But again, I'm not a dream expert.
So just FYI, I just shared a link from Scientific American, why COVID-19 pandemic is changing our dreams. So, yeah, no, there has been quite a bit of research looking at the shifts in dream states post-pandemic from psychologists, neurologists, sleep specialists. So the phenomenon that you're observing, your question is not in this list anymore, so now I don't remember whose name that was. Olivia. The phenomenon you're observing is a thing. It is definitely a thing. Because none of us, Yeah, you're not alone in it. But because none of us are sleep specialists, none of us want to take the opportunity to tell you why that's a thing. But you can start with this Scientific American article. There is a bunch of research about it online. It's definitely a conversation that's happening outside of our immediate disciplines.
So we are kind of out of time, but I do want to wrap this. I want to answer this last question from Kellyanne, and then any last thoughts from the panelists. Kellyanne says, have you found that the sense of loneliness, especially through this pandemic, that other aspects of individuals' mental health get active, for example, like more panic attacks? We know loneliness is connected to other concerns, both physical and mental. I don't know panic attacks specifically. I know fatigue. I know fatigue increases, your sense of well-being decreases, your sense of anxiety can increase. So I don't have specific information about panic attacks.
So there's also,
No.
So yeah, there's also a bunch of research. This one is on loneliness pandemic, loneliness and other concomitants of depression, anxiety, and comorbidity during the COVID-19 outbreak. This is the NIH study, but much of the brief summaries of it is saying that we are not statistically, again, please never take statistics to be dismissive of your individual experience.
Yeah.
But statistics, we're seeing anxiety and loneliness somewhat on the decline, because usually anxiety is correlated. Anxiety and panic attacks are generally social phenomena, or socially induced. So you obviously can have individual panic attacks, but when we talk about the statistics of anxiety and depression, anxiety and panic attacks are often considered to be socially induced. They're coming from these interactions that you're having. But generally we're seeing that the loneliness hasn't increased despite the pandemic, but nonetheless, we're having more intense emotional responses, even though these statistics are not necessarily changing. So it's kind of like climate change, right? Pence said that there's not more hurricanes. And so making the argument that that's not climate change, but the truth is the hurricanes are becoming more intense. So it's a different metric. But there's a whole bunch of research on anxiety during the pandemic and how that is changing for different people. So I'm sorry, I will always just share like articles and chat windows of Zooms.
But that's why we're here. We're here to have this conversation and continue the conversation, even though our time is ending. So I will say to anyone in the audience, if you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I don't want to volunteer my other panelists, but you're more than welcome to. Oh, okay. Joel's nodding.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can email me.
Yeah, please reach out to us. We are happy to continue this conversation. It's a conversation worth having because I don't think loneliness, unfortunately, is going away. But what we know about loneliness and how to manage it is increasing. So there's hope. We can, and I'm going to echo something that Cherise said earlier, that loneliness, while it can be chronic, is a temporary state. So again, there's hope. Joel, Cherise, any last thoughts?
Thank you for putting this together. It's been a lovely conversation, and I think one of the things that, so I'm deep in my gender, my gender module for my students, and one of the things that we did not discuss is the way in which being emotionally available and engaging with one's emotions has become a gendered activity, to the point where women are, where talking about your emotions are feminized, and therefore men are discouraged to talk about their emotions, be emotional, engage with it. And that can result in all sorts of other terrible outcomes, right? Men are 4 times as likely to suicide in the United States, much of which is correlated to an inability to engage. If anything, I would argue that these conversations and a greater awareness in the pandemic that we need each other, and this is a point that exists regardless of gender. If anything, I'm hoping that on the other side, we may be less emotional, actively engaging with our emotions, maybe less stigmatized for all genders and all people. And if there's any positive that comes out of that, that would be a big one.
Joel?
Yeah, I just thank you all for being a part of this. And for everyone that also attended, I hope you got something useful out of it. I think we covered quite a large swath of topics here in terms of organizations and society for loneliness. So yeah, like Lynn said, if you like to reach out, feel free to email me. Be happy to answer any other questions you have.
As a note, I'm the only Cherise Laprie on the internet. So if you just search Cherise Laprie, you'll find my information. I think we're both easily accessible. All of us are easily accessible in the SYR directory. So email's always open and virtual office hours are always available.
I'm not the only Lynn Vincent on the internet, but I think I'm the only Lynn Vincent at Syracuse. So it's that. I want to acknowledge Michael Cameron, Elizabeth Holloway, Allison Kessler, who helped organize this and brought this together. We have Caitlin Levine, who is our interpreter, who's done a fantastic job. We have our closed captioner, Kim, is doing such an exceptional job. So I want to thank them, and I want to thank my panelists for having a fantastic conversation and making me feel a little less lonely. So thank you.